It's my pleasure to introduce 2021 Read by the Sea mainstage author Rebecca Thomas. Rebecca is an award-winning Mi'kmaq children's author, poet, spoken word artist, and activist who lives in Halifax Regional Municipality. The daughter of a residential school survivor, she is a self-described change maker, a strong advocate for Mi'kmaq and Indigenous rights and awareness. Rebecca uses her writing as a powerful tool to educate people about misconceptions, racism, and whitewashed history. She wants to provide a different perspective, start conversations, and remind Canadians that Indigenous people are still very much here. Rebecca used her time as Halifax's Poet Laureate from 2016 to 2018 to be a Mi'kmaq voice in the room. In 2019, she published her first book for children, I'm Finding My Talk, illustrated by Pauline Young. A companion piece to Rita Joe's I Lost My Talk, I'm Finding My Talk received several accolades, including being shortlisted for the First Nations Community Reads Awards and 2 Atlantic Book Awards. It was named a Globe and Mail Top 100 Pick of 2019 and a CBC Best Picture Book of 2019. Last year, Rebecca published her second children's book, Swift Fox All Along, illustrated by Maya McGibbon. It was a finalist for both the 2020 Governor General's Literary Prize for Young People's Literature in the Illustrated Books category and the 2021 Doug Wright Award. Rebecca's poetry has been published in numerous journals and magazines, and in 2020 she released her first poetry collection, I Place You Into the Fire. No surprise, it was a CBC Best Canadian Poetry Pick of the Year. As captain of Halifax's slam poetry team from 2014 to 2017, Rebecca helped raise the profile of spoken word in Halifax Regional Municipality. She led the team to 3 national competitions with the Canadian Festival of Spoken Word. Rebecca holds a master's degree in social anthropology. She has served as a student recruiter in First Nations communities for Dalhousie University and Nova Scotia Community College, a senior diversity and inclusion consultant to the Government of Nova Scotia, and in the role of Community Outreach and Communications for the Dalhousie University Aboriginal Health Science Initiative. She currently works as a Student Services Advisor and Indigenous Support Person with Nova Scotia Community College. When she isn't advocating, writing, or performing, you will likely find her outdoors, hiking, running, fishing, or gathering. A warm Read by the Sea welcome to Rebecca Thomas.
Well, Al and Lana, thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I'm going to be reading I'm Finding My Talk, but first, before I begin, I wanted to dedicate this book to my dad, who passed on as much as he could. He taught me what he had left and encouraged me to learn what he couldn't teach. Queso. I'm finding my talk, the one I never had, the one that the schools took away from my dad. I'm finding my talk one word at a time. Gwe, Walalin, Namultas. Sometimes they are very old, sometimes they rhyme. I'm finding my talk when I'm up on the stage, telling big stories or scribbling words on a page. I'm finding my talk, I'm meeting my family, I'm making new friends who choose to love me. I'm finding my talk with clumsy feet that pat down the grass with every drum beat. I'm finding my talk with every bead, my regalia speaks through each stitch and seam. I'm finding my talk, it's in my smudge bowl, when the smoke curls around me and makes me whole. I'm finding my talk, how it's written across the land, learning to take only what I need, Nidugalump helps me understand. I'm finding my talk through my community, from elders to kids, this world is still new to me. I'm finding my talk by speaking to my father, by loving him and being his daughter. I'm finding my talk by speaking with my sister, knowing we're different and I miss her. I'm finding my talk through my nephews and nieces, teaching them they are complete with all their different pieces. I'm finding my talk, it's on the inside. It's how I see the world through not one, but two eyes. I'm finding my talk, and it may take some time, but I'm learning to speak in a language that's mine. Olala.
Rebecca, you've shared that your father is a residential school survivor and that because of that experience, he lost his connection to his culture and his language. How old were you when you first started to learn what it means to be Mi'kmaq?
It's a very good question. For me, it's a continuous process, right? I think I went through stages of being told I was Mi'kmaq or Micmac at the time, to being told I was Aboriginal, to starting to connect with community, to then understanding what my dad went through and why we have the relationship that we do, to really feeling Ilnu. And like that was a process that is ongoing and probably started in earnest, I would say, in the end of my undergrad and beginning of my grad school. I put in a lot of effort to be able to connect to my communities, whether it be through my research, whether it be through my part-time jobs, whatever it was, I was really hungry to try to recapture and regain and relearn what my dad had lost. And I knew that it would make him proud and it made me proud, and I would say then, that's when I really transformed into kind of feeling Mi'kmaq and not just understanding that that's what I was.
And what has that journey been like for you so far?
Yeah, there's some doubt that's there sometimes. Sometimes I don't feel like I am as quote unquote like real or as legit, but I recognize that those insecurities come from a history of colonization. Like that was the whole point of residential school, was to create fear and shame and anxiety around my identity. And so sometimes I can get kicked back that way, especially if, I mispronounce a word and, somebody corrects me and I get embarrassed. Those sorts of things. But for now, I've been feeling a lot more confident, understanding that as a Mi'kmaq person, we're just as multi-dimensional and complex as many other people. So my pathway can be through advocacy or through literature or through activism and kind of stumbling through language. It doesn't have to be a monolith or one identity for it to be real.
Since I'm finding my talk, you've written a second picture book for children, Swift Fox All Along, about a little girl who goes with her dad to meet his family and learn about his culture for the first time. Now, she has a lot of butterflies in her stomach. She's very nervous about this experience, and you've said that you feel most nervous when you're performing for an Indigenous audience.
Yeah.
Why is that?
I think it stems back to kind of that previous answer where I'm afraid I'm not going to be good enough for them. Like there's an anxiety that they're going to say, oh, this woman calls herself Mi'kmaq, like, oof, and so there's a little bit of anxiety there because I didn't grow up, on reserve. But people have been so kind and so understanding, and sometimes the folks who aren't quite as kind, I understand, are also coming from a history of residential school and pain and trauma. And I know a lot of folks, try to come into our communities for a benefit. And so I understand that protectiveness. So I'm a little less nervous now, but I still get jitters just because I want them to see me and be proud of me and be proud of me as being a part of the Mi'kmaq Nation. So I think a lot of it is just stemming back to that little kid who wants to fit in but isn't quite sure how to do it, and kind of finding my confidence and letting the butterflies free, so to speak. So it's getting better as I get older, but it still makes me nervous.
You're well known for a variety of different roles, being a strong advocate and activist for the Mi'kmaq community, being a children's author, and a very talented spoken word poet. I'm wondering what came first for you, the activism or the writing? Or did they both evolve at the same time?
I think they evolved together, but really I think what came first was my, academic experience. When I went to university, I didn't know much at all about the history of Canada and Indigenous people. Like I knew stuff but I had limited exposure to it because my dad wasn't necessarily always in my life in a really concrete way when I was younger. And so as I learned as an academic through my graduate work, I started to learn a lot more about, history, but I was always very kind of curious as to why I was learning all of this stuff from white academics, right? I was like, well, where are the indigenous academics? Why am I not hearing it from there? And so I think part of my outspokenness started to creep up in academia first, because I wanted to hear these stories from people who were like me and who had these same experiences as my dad. And so I was speaking up more in university, and then the creative writing side, because I did lots of academic writing, having written I don't know how many papers and a thesis and all that sort of stuff, but the creative writing sort of came a little bit after the outspokenness, and I saw that I had a knack for it and people listened when I did it. So I would say activism by a hair, but writing closely followed.
Last year you published your first adult poetry collection, I Place You Into the Fire, featuring many of your spoken word poems. Why did you choose spoken word, that particular art form, as the vehicle for your messages? How were you introduced to spoken word?
Yeah, I was introduced by a former colleague at NSCC who actually said, have you ever heard of Elle Jones? And Elle Jones was the poet laureate prior to me. She's a black poet. She speaks a lot about incarceration and black women, and to see how passionate she was, but also how accessible poetry was, it sparked a desire to try something new in me that I'd never had before. Somebody who doesn't like to try and learn in front of other people, who's quite shy when it comes to that. I wanted to try it right away, and I had written this poem about, it was called Sweetgrass in the City, and it was about growing up off reserve and kind of finding my confidence as an urban Indigenous person. I give all the credit to Elle Jones, and then she was an incredible mentor, officially or unofficially. She was so encouraging that I try for so many things. And so really, it all started with Elle. I have to give her all the credit in the world for that.
You've mentioned being a bit shy at times. How do you feel when you're on stage or in front of an audience performing your work?
It depends on the audience, I would say. When I'm presenting in front of a group of poets, it's loud and people are stomping their feet and snapping their fingers and, exclaiming things that they agree with or lines that land really well. When I'm performing in front of a very, for lack of a better word, professional crowd of like suits, they tend to be really quiet. And I'm assuming it's out of respect, but it can vary significantly, and I think depending on what I'm expecting. If I'm expecting really quietness, then that's okay. But if I'm expecting perhaps a little bit more audience participation and it's really quiet, then I start getting a little nervous. I get a little sweaty. I wonder if people are liking what it is that I have to say. So I think it really depends on the expectation that I have set for myself before I go on stage. And if that expectation isn't met, I start getting nervous.
And you yourself went on to serve as Halifax's Poet Laureate. For the majority of us who will never have that experience, can you tell us what exactly the role is of a Poet Laureate?
Thankfully, the folks who kind of organize and run the Poet Laureate program, so Jamie McClellan, has been really wonderful in allowing the poet in the position to really mold the role as they see fit and what it is that they want to do. And so for me, Elle was right before me, and she had a really strong, advocacy voice, and I really admired that, and I really wanted to do that. So in that role, I decided to use it because I was the first Indigenous person to advocate and speak up for so many Indigenous causes, especially around, the Edward Cornwallis statue and how that kind of came through my 10 years Poet Laureate. But there are some official duties, like you have to do 6 official city events, which include readings in council, as well as I did a New Year's one, and I did a Canada Day one, and I also did the Halifax Explosion 100-year anniversary. So I had a lot of pretty significant ones, Canada 150. So that was my kind of piece as being Poet Laureate, but it was also an opportunity for me to kind of raise concerns, to people who make decisions and have access to them and have them listen to me. And so that came with a big sense of responsibility that I had to make sure that I was, making my community proud and bringing forward concerns that I think a lot of us had, but didn't necessarily have the access to individuals to make decisions for us.
Your poems can be hard-hitting. You confront people with uncomfortable truths, and you particularly did that, I think, with the poem that you wrote as Poet Laureate for the Canada 150 celebrations. What kind of reactions do you get when you confront people with things that maybe they haven't thought about before, or maybe they're not quite ready to think about?
I think, again, it depends on who's listening. I know with the Canada Day 150 poem, it's called What Good Canadians Do, and so much of Canada likes to uphold themselves as this country with a reputation of being kind and inclusive and accepting, but you only need to look back to the news cycle these past couple of weeks to see how much, how insidious Canada can actually be. So when it came to that poem, it was me holding a mirror up to what people said that they were proud of to be Canadian, and kind of held them to account, saying, like, you do these things, you say these things, so do you actually do them? And so in that instance, I kind of tricked a bunch of really kind of patriotic, rah-rah Canadian supporters at the festivities into cheering for a poem critical of Canada. But for the most part, I get really good reception. But sometimes if you're kind of preaching to the choir, sometimes, depending on who's following you on social media. And other times I get, I've had some emails that have been really hateful and scary sent to me from anonymous accounts, and I think, unfortunately, that's the reality of, non-white people, especially women in positions that are being critical of a country like Canada. So it's a bit of a mixed bag.
In the endnotes of your poetry collection, you actually thank your haters for adding fuel to the fire. When you encounter detractors, how does that fuel your motivation?
I think it can be motivating because what it signals to me is that I need to come up with another avenue, another approach to perhaps having a conversation with this person or individuals or collective to understand my point. If it's just straight up hateful racism or misogynistic things that are just meant to scare me or make me feel really uncomfortable, then I know that I'm not going to convince these folks that I am worthy of respect or that Indigenous people are worthy of Canada to care about us. But when it's somebody who, for lack of a better word, is kind of ignorant in that they don't know, they never were taught the history, they don't have a large group of Indigenous friends or something like that, then I think about how can I modify my approach to be more appealing to them or help them understand a little bit better. And I've actually had some folks come around on Twitter, of all places, right? To think that you could win an argument on Twitter and have someone change their mind. But it can be motivating because it's, there's many different paths to take to get to a destination, and you can't build a house if the only tool in your toolbox is a hammer. So for me, it's about trying to be clever in how I kind of approach people.
Can you tell us a little bit about the title of your poetry collection, I Place You Into the Fire, and how it was inspired by 3 different Mi'kmaq words that on paper look very similar, but that actually have 3 very different meanings?
Yeah. I know for me, especially when I'm performing poetry, I will hold the syllable longer or make something more emphasized to really push home a point. But then when I was learning Mi'kmaq, and I still am, I am by no means anywhere close to being able to hold a conversation, but I am learning words. But as I was learning Mi'kmaq, realizing that holding a syllable for a length of time can completely change the meaning of the word. So having to wrap my brain around how I get points across has been a really big challenge for me. So for example, Gisalul is I love you. Gisalul is I hurt you. Gesalul is I place you into the fire. So you can understand why you might want to say I love you, but then you're actually saying I hurt you, and that's a very different meaning altogether. So it's a challenge. Same thing with like Abid and Ibid. One is woman, one is, sitting, right? And so it's a challenge to say the least. And I think that I will be challenged in this language for the rest of my life, but it is a really cool sensation to get a pronunciation correct and have somebody who grew up speaking Mi'kmaq say, "You did a good job. I know what you mean."
And why did you choose that third word, Ge Sa Lul, or I Place You into the Fire, as the title for this particular collection?
It was a bit of a play as well on like hold their feet to the fire, like a bit of accountability for me. So I really wanted to show the world, like I am holding Canada and its citizens accountable. I'm placing them into the fire, putting them in the hot seat, right? There's a ton of metaphors around that. But I also really like the first two iterations of Gesalul and Gesalul about how I love my family and my community and my culture. And then also all the ways that I've been hurt by my family and colonialism and a lot of pain that can come along being on this journey. So, and it was my editor's brilliant mind to separate the sections in the book according to these three words too. So I have to give lots of props to Whitney Morin for her genius in that.
We've had a few questions submitted by your readers, and I'd like to finish off with those. One reader was interested in what the transition has been like for you from writing poetry that's primarily for an adult audience to writing for children, and what seemed to be very personal stories for children.
I think it's a part of the evolution of me, when I wrote a lot of these poems, I was angry and frustrated, and I didn't have a direction, and I was just kind of having emotions all over the place. And when I wrote these kids' books, I was approached, so it wasn't my idea. I had two publishing houses reach out to me and said, "We would really like you to write a kids' book." I really changed, I think, my need, and I looked back and I'm like, well, what were the books that I needed as a little kid? Like, what did I need to see? Because I didn't see books about, brown kids or Indigenous kids or kids whose parents were divorced and kids who only saw their parent on, the weekends or occasionally, or about feeling nervous about who they are. Like, I didn't see those books. And so I thought I wrote these books very much for myself, for young Rebecca, as well as all the Indigenous kids that I know are out there that are missing this representation in their books as well. There's a lot more now, but it's I'm happy to be able to contribute to that kind of growing collection.
Now, a fan noticed in your introductory video for Read by the Sea that you were wearing some very unique, beautiful beaded earrings. And they were wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about those.
I think the earrings I were wearing were these kind of big blue and yellow flowers, if I'm not mistaken, like beaded flowers. And so they're from Adine Beater. She's on Instagram. Her work is Kiwi Kind, so you should be able to find her, and it's K like WIIKINE, if I remember correctly. And she's an Indigenous student who has essentially been paying her way through university through her beadwork, which is really incredible. And her works are incredibly popular. She will post something, and within 45 seconds, they're gone. And so she's the only person I set up post notifications for, and when she posts earrings, wherever I happen to be, I will stop. If I'm walking in the middle of the street, I will pull my car over safely, and I will jump on, and I will try to grab a pair of her earrings. And I think I have tried, and I've had at least on 6 different occasions, something in my shopping cart, only to get to the pay page and someone's already paid for it. So you don't have choice, you see what is available and you just buy it. And her work is incredible, and it took me 2.5 years to be able to get a pair of those earrings. And I love her work. I think the fact that she is paying for her, her college through that. And it shows the really beautiful melding of kind of Indigenous fashion and tradition and practice that, we as Indigenous people can be really modern and traditional at the same time.
And finally, Rebecca, readers would like to know what you're working on right now.
Yeah, I'm working on another children's book. I don't know if it's going to be picked up or not, but it's a story around my grandfather's chair. I spent, my whole life growing up in and around that chair with him. He would take care of me when I was little, and as he got older and sicker, I started taking care of him. He taught me about crosswords from that chair. I learned to read an analog watch from that chair. My friends and I hung out in that chair. So it's a story about the relationship that I had with my grandfather centered around this chair. And then the grief of when he passed away, of having this chair but not knowing what to do with it. So that's that book. I hope it comes through. I would really love to be able to publish that. And I am trying my hand at fiction, at writing a novel. I don't know if I'm going to be good at it or not, but I'm not going to know that unless I try. So there you go.
Well, we will definitely be watching eagerly for that next picture book and for your new work of fiction that you're working on.
Thank you. It might be several years before you hear from that book, but
Rebecca Walalan, thank you so much for sharing your stories and your words with us today. It's been a real pleasure.